Hello and welcome to the forum. I'm John Mattison. Today we're going to talk to Zubeida Jaffer, a legendary Cape Town journalist, about her third book about Charlotte Maxeke, who was perhaps the most important, or undoubtedly the most important woman in the early days of the struggle, and the first South African woman to get a university degree. And later we'll be talking to a board member of Wikipedia South Africa about preserving memory and knowledge in a time when the University of Cape Town's terrible fire happened this week and many great books and knowledge materials were lost. First, Zubeida, welcome.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure being here with you. It's like old times.
That's right. Now, Zubeida, you have a degree from Rhodes University, a degree from the University of Cape Town, and a master's from Columbia University. And I was also looking at your new book, your latest book, Beauty of the Heart, about Charlotte Maxeke. And I noticed that you use the UCT library. So you must be particularly devastated at the news this week.
Yes, I couldn't even look at the photographs, John. I was so traumatized, and it's just beyond, I mean, any library, when a library burns, it has such connotations, you know, because in world history, you know, it's associated with backwardness. So this isn't the case, but I mean, it just absolutely went straight to our hearts.
Yeah, doesn't feel good at all. Now, the book is called Beauty of the Heart, and Charlotte was really a pioneer in South Africa. Her first extraordinary accomplishment, though, was to get a degree, a Bachelor of Science.
Yes, she got a Bachelor of Science degree at Ohio University in the US, in a way by chance, because she was in a choir, South African choir, the Jubilee Choir, that toured the United States as it had toured Britain earlier, and then they were stranded and abandoned by their British managers, which also happened in the UK. And then the AME Church read about their plight of this South African choir, and they approached them and they sent the choir back to South Africa, but they kept behind Charlotte and 4 or 5 others because they were very impressed with her in particular, and they offered her a scholarship. So it was a lifelong dream. She had gone to the US, she had gone to the UK with this vision in mind that she wanted to study. And of course, that time she couldn't study in South Africa, not study at UCT, which is the only university virtually, one of the few universities, because it was just for whites. So
what about women? Were white women admitted to UCT in those days?
There was just, I don't have the dates, but it's in my book. It's just a few years before Charlotte graduated that there were, I think, 4 women that were allowed. You know, it was also an issue. 4 women were allowed, and then 4 white women, and they got the degrees. So it's more or less the same time that happened. So women generally were not, part of the educational establishment.
Now, there are several, I mean, South Africa, democratic South Africa has embraced her. They've named one of our submarines after her, and also a hospital. But people don't necessarily know much. I learned a lot reading your book. She made a contribution in a number of areas. And I want to start off looking at her call for the vote, she met Emily Pankhurst, the suffrage, who later became a suffragette leader in England. She managed to get around.
I mean, that I found quite extraordinary because look, she was 21 years old. She was part of a choir, the Jubilee Choir, and they sang for the Queen, and then she stayed on in England for quite a long while. She and her sister, and they met Emily Pankhurst, which I found really unusual. I mean, this is a young African girl, you know, from Utenhage, from PE, from Kimberley, and meeting Emily Pankhurst and hobnobbing with, the sort of the activist circles in the UK. So she must have had something, she must have had some kind of natural flair that made people notice her.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt when you read what she achieved and the people she met and the places she went and the people who took her seriously, it's quite clear. I mean, the interesting thing is in those days, women in Britain didn't have the vote.
No, they didn't have the vote, and so that's why I was saying, it's just all, the women's movement in the world was still very sort of fledgling, and in many ways, Charlotte was ahead of her time.
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, you tell the story that, before we get to that, let's talk about what she did overseas. As you say, she sang in a choir that sang for Queen Victoria. But of course, it was a sort of designed by the Brits as a sort of a colonial exercise, which was to show the conversion of heathens into Christians.
Yes, it was. That was the whole exercise, and there was even dispute in the public media that the songs that they were singing couldn't have been, the original songs because they were so, exquisite. And but the journal, I think it was a musical review journal, it pointed out that these were the songs, and it was the songs that belonged to the people of South Africa, and that in fact it was of a very high quality musically, and that people had to sort of start questioning their preconceptions about prejudice.
So in America, she went to university, did a bachelor's degree in science, but she also befriended. She was taught by W.E.B. Du Bois, however you want to say it, and of course he was the great Pan-Africanist. And she became close to his wife, in fact, before they were married. And she really won over some pretty significant intellects of the day.
She did. And 30 years later, W.E.B. Du Bois, I'm also not quite sure how the best phrase, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in an incredible, kind of song to her. I mean, yes. a praise song, which I published in my book. And, it was really, it's something which, when I still read it today, then I feel quite emotional because it describes the challenges she went through, and then it also shows what high regard he held her, which is not a small achievement, I would say.
Right. So she comes back to South Africa and she plays a significant role in the political life of the country, the religious life of the country, and in the educational life of the country. The first thing I thought was interesting, before we go to a break, she comes back and she attends the Cape South African National Congress, which wasn't really the future ANC, but something similar, in 1902, and she's the only woman there.
Yes, she goes there, and it's quite interesting to, one thinks why she went, because she was on her way to her father's village in the north, in Ramagopa village, and she then stopped over in Queenstown at Lessiton. And I call it the Lessiton moment because she went to Lessiton because she must have become aware that there was a conference there. And then she arrived and uninvited, and she asked if she could participate and if women could participate. And then the 40 men who had gathered there, they formed a committee to deliberate about this matter. And well, it was 1902. And then they decided that no, women must organize themselves separately and that she couldn't participate. And this could have ended there if it were not for Sal Plaat, the journalist,
Right.
who was part of her circle. Charlotte was part of a circle, essentially the Kimberley circle of highly motivated young people. And then Sal Plaatje climbed in and he really gave it to them. I'm so sorry I wasn't able to find the speech that she actually made there. There is a speech, but we looked everywhere. But he refers to the speech in the article, and he says that hers was the neatest little speech out of all those 40 men.
I have the quote here. She sort of excoriates the men and says she was their intellectual superior.
Sal Plaatje excoriates. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. She was she was the only one with a degree there, and but they excluded her.
Right.
So what was very interesting for me was that both Charlotte and Sal Plaatje were way ahead of their time because the analysis he clearly says that he's against race and sex discrimination. And
We have to take a break there, Zubeida. Sorry, but we will be right back. And we're back talking to Zubeida Jaffer about her third book. Zubeida, that's a very interesting vignette, but of course, after that, the real damage to African rights and potential was the Union in 1910. And that caused enormous devastation to Black South African rights and led to the 1930 Land Act, which affected newspapers, Black newspapers, businesses, education. It was devastating.
Yes, indeed. Those two dates, 1910 with Union, which excluded the majority of people, and then 1913, which took most of the land from, the indigenous people.
But interestingly, she continued to fight. She was in a delegation to the Prime Minister, Louis Botha, and a couple of delegations to ministers of Native Affairs. So it's quite hard to have imagined something like that happening 50 years later.
What do you mean 50 years later?
Well, 50 years later, Mandela couldn't get a meeting with the white government. She managed it in those days, in the teens and 20s.
Yes, I think it was still the sort of the early days of, that you had colonialism. You didn't have, the sort of extensive authoritarianism of apartheid. So you had your colonial, sometimes benign, sometimes harsh, but it was still there sort of some engagement with the colonial authorities. So she took those gaps with other organizations like the APO, Dr. Abdurrahman and others. It was so interesting for me because I thought she always sort of joined and kind of involved, connected with other organizations all the time.
Right. She played a leadership role, as I read it in your book, very strongly in three different areas, in education, in politics, and in the church. How do you see her leadership role?
I think she was firm, always firm, and always concerned about the welfare of people around on the ground. And I didn't get the sense that she was I wouldn't say she was gentle. I do think she was forthright. She was extremely
Yes.
forthright. But she spoke at a certain point, I think it was in 1928, if I can remember properly, where she spoke about beauty of the heart, and she spoke about the importance of dignified conduct.
And at a time when women weren't allowed into the ANC, she became president of the Bantu Women's League, and she was one of the founders of it.
She was one of the founders of the Bantu Women's League, but she also, despite her earlier experience at Lexington in 1902, was the only woman present at the launch of the ANC in 1912. And I suspect that she just rocked up. They didn't exclude her this time. That's what I suspect. I can't imagine that they would have asked her to come. Her husband was there, so she came with her husband. And what has been fascinating for me, she's been largely written out of history, forever. It's taken forever to get her back. But she was also, to some extent, I never knew, and I've asked several people, there was never ever mention of her as being present at the launch of the ANC.
Yeah. And she also played a leadership role in the establishment of various educational institutions, including the Wilberforce Institute in Everton, outside Joburg.
Yes, and it's still there. It's still there. Apartheid closed a lot of these institutions or took it over, but the AME Church, I think, resisted that, and so didn't kind of give the school over. And post 94, our government has helped to revive it, and it's really, I've been there. It's really interesting, and if I were in a position of authority, I would say let's really develop that, in a major way, because it's in a community of Everton, and it's lovely. It's got as a missionary, not a missionary, a priest school for priests or pastors, and then it's now a college, a community college.
Right. So she, that's one part of her enduring legacy. She was also involved in establishing various church organizations around the AME Church.
Oh well, she was the prime mover of the AME Church. She had introduced the AME Church to our uncle while she was in America, and as a result, the church there was connections. And she was also the first president of the Women's Missionary Society. I think that's what it's called. She was a member there when she was a student, and then she came over and she took charge of the situation and also organizing. So she's got a very, very, very rich legacy. And
now the AME Church, from your book, I found it's very interesting. She connected the African American
yes.
church connection, but it also came together with some Black South Africans who'd been in the Christian churches here, but felt discriminated against, and so they came together in the AME from both sides.
Yes, it was an effort to kind of assert African independence, and to kind of say they were tired of being within white churches that didn't treat them fairly. So it was that impulse. So Charlotte, right throughout in the church and in other work, was very much in favor of self-reliance of the African people.
Yes, and she was a practicing Christian.
Yes, of course.
Right. It's really interesting. So the AME is still a very significant church in South Africa.
It's huge. It's huge.
Yeah, and then of course in 1943 the ANC finally accepted women, but that was already after her death.
Yeah, she died in 1939, and so she didn't see that.
So, and of course, those were the really tough years for the ANC, the 20s and the 30s, where things really were very difficult and the opportunities had just been closed off at every turn.
Yes, and Charlotte died in substantial poverty, which is really sad. And she didn't have an easy time in those later years. And so as the noose was tightening, as the sort of the situation was changing, and it became more and more, South Africa became more and more authoritarian. She was, of course, at the receiving end in real terms. And so there is a great sad part of it, but I'm happy to see that people are not focusing on that, too much.
Right. What do you think of the way the government has revived her name with naming a submarine after her and a hospital? I'm sure she'd have liked the hospital. Would she have liked the submarine?
Yeah, I found the submarine a strange, strange thing. And then even the hospital, because Mom Charlotte was a teacher. And so often when I meet people and I speak about her, then they say, "Oh, the nurse," they talk about the nurse.
Mm-hmm.
And so there hasn't yet been an appropriate, naming that could lodge her strongly within the teaching fraternity.
And her legacy. I mean, her legacy also is as a woman, because she broke open many doors to women.
Yes, she was she was the first person to speak at a royal gathering of the Abatembo, I think it was, and there was just many other firsts for her. So she was a path breaker. She's a trailblazer, and I feel so absolutely kind of humbled to have had the privilege of writing her story.
So the final question, obviously, if she came back now to democratic South Africa and she looked at our ANC and our Women's League and at the state of the country, what do you think she'd say?
I do think that from the way I read her, I think firstly she would be astounded to see how far we've come. I mean, if you look at the young women and you look at, the graduates and you look at all that, but I still believe that her biggest concern would be dignified conduct, beauty of the heart, because I see it coming through in so many ways. I saw it coming through, and I think and what we're seeing today, we're seeing on display some of the most ugly behaviors and the most ugly conduct. And so unless we put this on the national, we debate this and we say, is this what we are showing our young children? Or is this what we're showing the next generation, that this is the way in which to do business? Then what are we going to have in 20 years' time? So I would say she would be most concerned about that.
Yeah. Zubeida, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. The book is Beauty of the Heart. It's one of 3 books Zubeida has run. And of course, you have your own publishing house, so you publish your own books now.
Yes, the people can buy it at my online shop through Zubeida Jaffer, my website, or Number 10 Publishers. And, I just feel such a pity if, all this work has been done to put together the story, and if it just gathers dust. I'm hoping that people will read.
Well, Zubeida, I've read it. I enjoyed it. I encourage people to read it. It's a slice of our history that very few of us know. It taught me a lot of lessons. Thank you, Zubeida Jaffer. We'll be back in a moment talking to Douglas Scott about Wikipedia South Africa. And we're back. My next guest is Douglas Scott, former president of Wikipedia South Africa and now on the board. As you know, this week the University of Cape Town had a terrible fire that damaged its library. and destroyed some of its material. So I wanted to ask Douglas what we can do to preserve memory in these current times. Douglas, welcome to the forum.
Thank you, Johnny.
Douglas, what do you know, first of all, about what's been lost at the University of Cape Town?
Only what's reported in the media, and so what I've read so far is that up to 85,000 documents from 1,200, 1,300 different collections at the university library, throughout the University of Cape Town's library system, might have been lost. Some number, as high as 85,000. But it's still quite unknown. It's known that sort of some of those documents might have been saved due to fire doors and other sort of precautionary measures. But the point is, a lot of cultural, historical, and other types of heritage have been lost in the blaze.
For people like you and for many of us who are book people and who, I use that library for some of my research for one of my books, it's a terrible loss.
Oh, it's a tragic, terrible loss. It really reminds me of the burning down of the museum in Brazil a couple of years back, which was a huge blow to Brazil's sort of cultural identity.
Yes.
For me, this is sort of a similar sort of experience. It's really a great, tragic loss for the country.
And I suppose, as someone who's in the field at Wikipedia, it stresses the urgency of measures to preserve.
Absolutely, yes. I suppose it's particularly frustrating for us because we're a digitally based organization, and a part of that is encouraging libraries, archives, and museums to digitize their content first and foremost. And secondarily, we would obviously like to digitize it in a format that has got an open copyright, so that it is freely accessible for people around the world to use. And Wikipedia happens to have such a platform. If they can release under an open copyright, Wikipedia actually provides a platform for storing that data in an easily accessible means for use on Wikipedia and for use for public benefit.
Have you talked to, has Wikipedia talked to UCT and other universities in South Africa about this?
Not yet, but we do plan to. We've got good relations with the University Library Network, and we do want to sort of consult them about sort of the way forward here to really encourage greater digitization of archives, libraries, and museum material onto the internet for public benefit and for everyone in the world to access, really.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about Wikipedia. You're there as a volunteer. You have a day job. That is part of the spirit of Wikipedia. It's open to everybody. My first question is, what is a wiki?
Very good question. A wiki is essentially a open-based digital platform that allows a community of people to collectively edit and add things. And that could be on anything. I mean, there are literally thousands of different types of wikis out there. The wiki I'm most involved with, and the wiki that most people know most about, are most aware of, is Wikipedia, the free online encyclopedia. And you're right, I edit that entirely as a volunteer. In fact, everyone who edits that does so in their volunteer capacity.
Can we trust it? I mean, universities sometimes are a bit skeptical about its reliability.
So this was a big sort of issue of debate about 10 years ago, and the academic journal Nature, did a study on this a good while back, and they found that Wikipedia is about as accurate as normal encyclopedias or historical encyclopedias such as Encyclopedia Britannica. So my answer to that is you can trust it insofar as you can a regular encyclopedia, but you should always read everything with a critical eye.
Mm-hmm. How do you maintain quality? Because anybody can go on it and add material.
A very good question, a very important one. And the answer to that is it's a group effort. So wikis are by their nature require involvement from as many people from a broader selection of humanity as possible to both maintain the quality, spot inaccuracies, but also pursue something what we call a neutral point of view, very important to our community. And a neutral point of view is kind of like a holy grail endeavor, and it requires a diverse range of people and a great number of people on any given topic, contributing to it to make it sort of more reliable, to make it more trustworthy, and undoing vandalism and things like that.
How substantial is South African content on Wikipedia, and how many people contribute?
Sadly, it's not as substantial as we would like. In terms of number of South African articles, there may be about 30,000 or so on English language Wikipedia. Number of South African editors, the last time we did a survey of South African editors, there were only about 400 in the country. This was about 5 years ago. We plan to do another one soon, get an updated number. We hope it's grown, but it's still very small. South Africa's presence in comparison to, say, Canadian content is very small and underrepresented.
And how much of South African content is produced by South Africans and how much by non-South Africans?
Ooh, that's an unknown, and we just don't know is the answer, because it's a global effort. The feeling I get is that a good proportion is produced by South Africans.
And what about the racial breakup? How much is it done by white people who can afford the time to do this for nothing? And how much is by people of all Africans or black South Africans?
So the last time we did a survey on this, like I said, it was about 5 years ago, we found that the overwhelming majority of editors in South Africa were white men, so people who look a lot like me, typically quite well educated, sort of university degree. And that, for us, that is a problem in the sense that we need a diverse range of people editing. So we need a greater diversity. So in the future, hopefully you'll be interviewing someone of a different complexion and demographic to myself about Wikipedia, because there will be sort of a more diverse community, a larger, more diverse community of editors in South Africa.
Now, I know you've been keen to get isiXhosa and other languages, Wikipedia really active. How far have you got? How many languages, South African languages, are on Wikipedia, and to what degree?
So almost all of the official languages of South Africa are on Wikipedia. Almost all. Some are not, and some exist, but they exist in what we call an incubator space. The big problem that South African language Wikipedias, other than English and Afrikaans, have is that there just aren't enough editors to form a community of editors. So I talked about how a wiki is basically relies on a community of people adding content. If you don't have the community, you don't have that engine of growth to provide the articles. And we're really trying to encourage people to edit in their local language to help grow the community of editors on, say, isiXhosa Wikipedia or isiZulu Wikipedia, because that's really, really needed. Because, I mean, isiXhosa Wikipedia has only got about 1,000 articles for 8 million speakers.
Right. So if somebody's watching this show and they want to produce isiXhosa content or Afrikaans or any other language, what do they do? How do they get involved? Is it easy?
It's very easy. All you need to do is to go to Wikipedia. You go to isiXhosa Wikipedia, and you can navigate there from the main page, or you can just type in xh.wikipedia.org, or you can just Google it. And you just go up to the top. You'll notice there's an edit button in the top right-hand corner. Press the edit button, and away you go.
So anybody can do that.
Anyone.
And then how does the quality control work so that someone comes from their home and they do it, and then you want to know how reliable it is, or if they have an axe to grind?
So for small language Wikipedias, well, by small language I mean the community of editors editing
Right.
wiki is small.
Right.
That's trickier. Because you need sort of a critical mass of people reviewing new articles, constantly proofing it. But we've got to start somewhere. So for English, it's no problem, because it's just over 150,000 editors editing English language Wikipedia. In English language Wikipedia or Afrikaans language Wikipedia, the editors are constantly reviewing each other's work. But we need to build up the community of editors for, say, isiXhosa language Wikipedia to reach that stage. So at the moment, even one person can make a huge difference in, say, the isiXhosa language on Wikipedia by adding content to it.
And that'll make a huge difference to the reliability too.
Yes, over time, as more and more people start editing it, that's right.
Yeah. Now, we're going to have to take a break, but when we come back, I'm going to ask you about Afrikaans, because obviously South Africa being South Africa, we have the obvious challenges when we come to that. We'll be right back with Douglas Scott of Wikipedia South Africa. And we're back talking to Douglas Scott of Wikipedia South Africa. Douglas, we just got on to the question of Afrikaans. What is your wiki community in Afrikaans look like?
So Afrikaans Wikipedia, other than sort of English or Portuguese or Arabic language Wikipedias, is by far got the healthiest community of all the African language Wikipedias in Africa, which is fantastic. There are some challenges that Afrikaans Wikipedia faces. It still needs more editors, for example, and it needs a greater diversity of editors so that it can have a more complete spectrum of content on Afrikaans language Wikipedia, and so that it's easier to pursue that neutral point of view that we regard as so very important.
So what you're saying, decoded, is that you have a very strong group of white Afrikaans speakers who are contributing, but not nearly enough who are not white.
That's right, yes. I do want to make it clear that we want sort of more editors generally in all languages, and even Afrikaans Wikipedia. But you're right, there's a particularly strong need for people of color to be editing Wikipedia, and women editors as well. Female editors as well.
Yes, we were talking before the show about the problem of not having enough women editors and women content. Both of those are a problem.
Yes, that's right. The lack of female editors in Wikipedia actually sort of really highlights why diversity of editors is such an important thing. And I actually got a story which sort of highlights this quite well. You remember a couple of years ago, there was the royal wedding, and someone decided to write an article about the wedding dress when the British royals got married. And there were members of the Wikipedia community that regarded that as not being notable. They all happened to be men. But there were a lot of other people, especially women, who regarded that as very, very notable. So there was a big argument that happened, and eventually the community decided that it should remain, and that this actually highlighted, I'm trying to take a step back, it really came to a head when Jimmy Wales, the founder of Wikipedia, made the comment that, of course, the article about the wedding dress should remain, because it seems insane that we're taking down articles about that so many people regard as notable, such as wedding dresses, when we have over 50 different article types for different USB types. So if it's like a nerdy sort of techie sort of subject, Wikipedia is very happy to accommodate it. But if it's not, then Wikipedia is more skeptical about it, and that's a reflection of the editor base. Right. Now, obviously, we want all the techie stuff, so we want the techies to continue editing, and we want more techies, but it really does highlight the need for greater diversity in the community so that we can sort of complete the representation of knowledge that is held in Wikipedia, and that requires a sort of a greater diversity of editors.
Right. What about the rest of Africa? How full is your material on the rest of the continent?
Very poor. It's unfortunate to say, and that's in all languages. And that's largely because not enough people are editing about African content. And who better to edit and add about African content on Wikipedia than people in Africa?
Right. And the African content that you do have, who's writing it? Is it being written in Europe or in South Africa, or is there substantial contribution inside African countries?
There seems to be a growing amount of contribution from Africa, which is great, but I've noticed that for many wikis, a lot of the contributions come from Europe, and some from North America, but a lot from Europe. That in itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but it does create structural distortions, to use complicated language. It makes it not a full reflection of realities on the ground.
Well, your point about neutrality, you can't really have successful neutrality if you're not getting people from inside the country
Absolutely, yes.
second guessing and editing what they get from Europe or North America
Oh,
or even South Africa.
Absolutely, and not just on a neutrality level, but also on a completeness level, because a person editing in Europe isn't going to have as complete an understanding of, say, an African topic, typically, as someone in Africa.
What about, I know that you've been involved in the copyright issue in South Africa. Why is that important to Wikipedia?
The answer is that as volunteer editors, we need sort of a copyright regime that is as friendly to volunteer public benefit activities such as Wikipedia as possible. And one of the elements of that is making copyright as easy to understand. Now, copyright law is famously complicated and devilishly difficult to understand. And one of the things we're advocating for is in the new bill, which is being proposed, which is waiting for presidential signature, is simplification of the law. The other one, and this is a very important, this is actually what got us on the road, is something called freedom of panorama. Currently, in South African law, and this is highlighted in one of the photographic competitions we held, encouraging people to take photographs of public monuments and submit them to Wikipedia. Currently on Wikipedia, in South Africa, if you were to photograph a public monument that was built in colonial times and put it on Wikipedia, typically that's fine, because the copyright on the public monument is expired because it's so old. But if you were to take a photograph of, say, a statue of Nelson Mandela or a struggle icon, like a recently built monument, publicly accessible work of art, and you would put it on Wikipedia, we would have to delete it because the copyright is still in force. So this creates a perverse situation where Wikipedia actually can't host images celebrating the struggle or commemorating the struggle against apartheid. But we can for colonial era monuments.
Right.
And that's purely because of how copyright law currently functions.
And the new law, which has gone through the House and the National Council of Provinces, the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces, would that solve the problem?
Yes, it would, because it does have a freedom of panorama clause in it. So in the new law, when it gets signed into law by the president, it will allow people to add those pictures of publicly available monuments on Wikipedia. It would also it'll also allow people to freely share pictures of those monuments as public artworks on Facebook and Instagram and other sort of internet platforms as well.
And it's been sitting on the president's desk for, I think you said, 2 years?
That's right, yeah. It's been sitting since, I think, March 2019. 2 years, yes.
And why do you think that is? Is it just that he's busy, or is there a kickback?
I don't know if there's a kickback. I do know that there's a lot of strong lobbying by people opposed to the bill. They're largely opposed to, from what I understand, they're opposed to sort of elements of the bill, such as the fair use clause, which I think, my opinion has been willfully misunderstood to be taking away people's copyrights creators, which is not the case. It actually, in my opinion, enhances the copyrights of creators. The other one is that collecting societies are typically strongly against it because the new law introduces criminal penalties for collecting societies that abuse artists. So if you're an artist, you record music, it typically goes to a collecting society to collect the royalties on your behalf. And the collecting society has got a legal obligation to pass those royalties onto you, the artist. Now, what's been happening in the past is that the collecting societies are sometimes failing in that obligation to pass the royalties onto the artists. And the new law introduces criminal penalties for when that happens.
And so what's the politics of it? Is the president being pressured by those groups?
Those groups are, yes, pressuring the president. They're certainly adding pressure onto the presidency.
Yeah, but the problem needs to be solved.
Yes, I mean, just need to sign the law. It's already passed through both houses of parliament, and in fact, it's it's not just us who are sort of suffering by not passing this into law. The blind community in particular are suffering, because the new law also allows for the enactment of the Marrakesh Treaty, which basically allows the blind community to copy content into Braille, so that the blind community can access reading material. And so the longer that the law is not signed into law, the longer the blind community have been deprived of their constitutional rights to access content, essentially. So the blind, I know the blind community are talking about taking legal action to force the presidency to sign this into law so that they can access their constitutional rights under the Marrakesh Treaty, which South Africa has signed.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. Just to finish off, I'd want to go back to the question of the universities. What should university libraries, and indeed all libraries, do to protect themselves from loss like we've seen this week in Cape Town?
Digitization of content is key. Because once you digitize content, not only do you protect it from fires, because it's held in the digital sphere, but also you can share it, and you can share it amongst a vast number of people. So even if one collection goes down, there's still X many hundreds or thousands of collections with the copy on it. So preservation of digital content is much easier than preservation of physical content.
And how far has South Africa got?
Oh, I don't know. You'd need to ask a library expert for that question.
Right. But I mean, Wikipedia. Not a lot of this gets to Wikipedia, I assume.
Not a lot of it at all. Very haphazardly. So only when individual editors are very passionate about a subject, let's say the history of Cape Town, and they say find a trove of photographs, very old photographs where the copyright has expired, and they choose to upload it themselves. Only then, typically, is that on Wikipedia, is that on sort of Commons.
Before we close, obviously you're appealing to South Africans, especially in languages that don't have enough attention, and women who don't get enough attention, to start using Wikipedia and start writing and editing onto Wikipedia.
Oh, we're very strongly advocating for people to edit Wikipedia, access Wikipedia, especially women, especially people of color.
And to write.
And to write, definitely, yes.
Yeah, because otherwise there's a continuing distortion.
That's right, yes.
Well, that's all we have time for. Douglas Scott of Wikipedia, thanks for being on the forum. I want to thank you for watching. I'm John Maddison. I hope you'll be with us next week.